I don't need to tell you folks too much about Judy. You're here because you've had an experience with Reindeer Chronicles that has moved you or sparked interest. It's such a beautiful set of stories about how nature can heal itself. And I think we're all here to learn more and to speak to Judy about her experiences researching that and exploring it herself. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Judy.
It is wonderful to be here in this beautiful barn. How did you describe it?
Tongue and groove.
Tongue and groove.
Yeah.
And then my husband immediately said, oh, our house is tongue in cheek. So anyway, just what can you say? So I was here once before, and I remember it quite vividly. This was many years ago now, and it was the annual Schumacher Lectures put on by your neighbor in Great Barrington, the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And Alan Savory was speaking, and I had helped kind of broker that deal. And I remember a couple of things stand out to me. One is that it was the end of October, I guess just before the cows were coming in. It's the end of October, it was really cold. Now, Alan is from Southern Africa, so that's his thermostat. He's like wired for Southern Africa. And I knew that he was really cold, but he wore this scarf, and he just looked so serene and dapper with his scarf, just so. I just thought, anyway, it made a real strong visual statement for me. And the other reason that event stood out to me so much was that Alan's presence was a sign that people's imaginations were opening, that people were open to new ideas. It signaled a shift in thinking, that ideas that up to then had been regarded as radical, if not outright rejected. So for people who don't know Alan Savory, he's the fellow who developed the crazy notion that ruminant animals can restore the landscape if appropriately managed. And this understanding is being applied on millions of acres on grasslands throughout the world, and it informs many operations, including Churchtown Dairy. So it's really influential. But even 10 years ago, the prospect of regenerative grazing was so new and radical that it got people riled up. I remember the first time that I wrote about Alan, I got a barrage of critical emails with dozens of peer-reviewed papers to tell me exactly why Alan was wrong and I was wrong, and anyway, that made quite an impression. The fact that Alan was here and not being thought of as a kook or a villain meant that something was really changing. So the notion of animals as agents of restoration is why I chose the cheeky title, Cows Save the Planet. And when I was thinking of what I was going to share with you today, I thought about my 3 books, and there's one word among the 3 titles that seemed particularly relevant. Now, it's not the word hope, water in plain sight, hope for a thirsty world, although I do have to confess I am kind of a hope junkie. But the word is improbable. And that's because nature's patterns, and therefore the solutions that we can tap into, are often counterintuitive. In our culture, we are trained to think, look at processes as linear. And what makes sense in a complex system may be improbable from a linear perspective, like cattle helping to restore landscapes. Okay, that's kind of improbable and counterintuitive. Now, when we encounter the improbable, and if we kind of move it around, turn it around in our hands and get a look at it in different light, it opens up our imaginations. Things seem possible that did not appear to be possible before. And the improbable idea that compels me now is the extent to which nature creates and regulates climate. That idea animates all three of my books, although I didn't realize that, I didn't fully grasp that until I wrote the Reindeer Chronicles. What I did understand is that nature's capacity, that the role that nature plays in climate is completely missing from the climate conversation. It's beginning to seep in now, actually, thanks in part to John Feldman's work. He did a beautiful film called Regenerating Life, which I absolutely recommend. We're very much on the same page. But the thing is that once you bring in that understanding that nature informs climate on many, many levels, then that brings us hope, because we know that we can restore even extensive damaged ecosystems. So then that means that we can restore at least some of that climate regulating capacity. So now let's look at some of these improbable examples, courtesy of nature. We'll start with Alan Savory, his work was my first introduction to the improbable, to cows saving the planet. Alan developed his holistic management framework based on a few core insights. One is that grasslands and grazing animals co-evolved so that the land needs the animals in the same way that animals need the land. Also, that land can be undergrazed as well as overgrazed, and that has ecological implications. And also that not all land behaves the same way. So that's actually a really profound observation that he made. He talks about brittle landscapes. A brittle landscape is one where there's a distinct rainy season and a distinct dry season where vegetation can get very brittle. So the way I think about it is that in those kind of landscapes, which by the way is complete opposite of where we are here, we get moisture fairly regularly throughout the year. So it's non-brittle. They should come up with a better term than non-brittle. It doesn't sound very evocative. But the way I think about it is that in a brittle landscape, nature had a challenge, and that was how to maintain moisture in the soil so you could sustain life from the end of one rainy season to the beginning of the next. And the solution that nature came up with was through the digestive system and behavior of ruminant animals, hence cows save the planet. I had this allowed Alan to come to the unlikely conclusion that the land in the northern Rhodesian game parks was degrading, not because there were too many animals, but because there were too few. And that was a pivotal understanding. I had the incredible privilege of spending a week with Alan and his wife and my husband, who's from Southern Africa too, South Africa. And it was really extraordinary to see the land through his eyes and to sit around a fire in the cool of the evening with a nice cool glass of white wine. Boy, after a hot day, that really, really hits the spot. And hear all sorts of stories from across a remarkable life. But in particular, it was his engagement with the landscape that was just so memorable. And Alan was primed to have that relationship with the landscape and to make these observations because he was an expert tracker. So witnessing his deep attunement to the land, I mean, I just remember, like, we would be walking and he would read the markings on the soil, and he'd be able to tell you whether it was a cow giraffe or a bull giraffe, and whether that animal was seeking water or was eluding a predator. And he could look at a landscape and tell you, where it was in terms of the transition to a healthier landscape. And one way he did that was by seeing what kind of grasses dominated. So animal-dependent grasses are higher order, that they require this whole dynamic with animals and biodiversity that kind of create the conditions for those plants to thrive, as opposed to grasses that are fire-dependent or bare ground-dependent, because land that is fire-prone or lacking in vegetation is far less healthy. So that was really interesting to see. The point is that nature is self-regulating and self-healing in complex ways that might not be obvious to us. So by suspending our tendency to think in a linear way, that opens up the possibility to observe the dynamics of a given ecosystem and align our actions with nature rather than against her. So another example, another improbable example, is the donkeys of Kachana Station. Now we're moving from Zimbabwe to Australia, and we happen to have two Australians right here, not just ordinary Australians, but Anthony and Olivia have spent a significant amount of time on this particular landscape, so, which is very special, and I really long to go there because I've been hearing about it for years, not just hearing about it, but feeling part of the drama that you will hear about. So donkeys were brought to Australia as pack animals as settlers moved into the outback, into the rural areas. Then, when mechanized transport became available, well, we don't need these long-eared things. The donkeys were set free, and they roamed around, and they formed bands, and or family groups, and they just kind of went around country. So the powers that be said that donkeys are not native to Australia, and therefore, by definition, they are pests, especially since they sometimes did naughty things like knock down fences, but that they should be eradicated. And so, I know different states have different things, but in Western Australia, which is this huge, huge state where the Kimberley is in the north, that's where Kachana Station is, they said that the donkeys needed to be eradicated, and that meant being shot from above. And donkeys are very, social, and they care about each other, and it's really, really unfortunate. Now hang on, farmer Chris Hengler would say, because that's what he always says when he's about to say something surprising. Now hang on. it doesn't have to be that way. So Hengler manages an area, a tract of land that is the size, well, pick your analogy, it's the size of Singapore, or, we might have some New Yorkers here, the size of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Okay, so it's this large area of land, and he manages it to restore ecological function. That is the purpose, and that's what they do by managing cattle. Their biggest challenge is fire. It is said that there is always some fire happening in the Kimberley. These fires can get really, really intense. So Chris and his father observed, when the donkeys showed up, they observed that the donkeys went places where the cattle didn't go. Like when it was rough terrain, when it was really close up to the edge of water, of rivers, and it was rocky, the donkeys weren't intimidated by that. They went and they would manage the vegetation. And so Chris and his father saw, oh, they are part of the fire crew. So they were really happy to have them there. Then they realized that they could herd the donkeys by helicopter so that they could encourage their firefighting behavior. So in short, the donkeys became an important part of the fire crew. Well, this has been an ongoing saga because the government still insists that Chris cull the donkeys, and his supporters, which include us, keep trying to educate officials so that they understand that not only is this helping the landscape, but there is research going on, the Wild Donkey Project, so that we can understand the impact of these donkeys on the landscape. So Chris and several scientists who are studying megafauna have learned a number of improbable things about the donkeys. First of all, donkeys and other animals that aren't native to a place are often understudied and therefore invisible to most scientists. I mean, why would you study donkeys? Wouldn't you want to study kangaroos? I mean, that's where everybody's head is, except for these maverick scientists who are working on the donkey project. So studying their impact on the land reveals that they are filling an ecological niche that has been void since the end of the late Pleistocene. We're talking 30 to 40,000 years. So they're fulfilling all these functions that had not been fulfilled. And that is what Chris was observing, that they are browsing and cycling moisture and nutrients so that the vegetation doesn't just dry out and become fire fuel, because there's plenty of fire fuel around and plenty of fires. So they don't need that. Also, the donkeys dig wells, which creates a water resource for other wildlife. So, in fact, in doing that, they fill a niche that the giant wombat used to fill tens of thousands of years ago. So these wells that the donkeys dig, the scientific term for them is assholes. Sorry, but that's true. Okay. Their habit of moving brush around creates habitat for vulnerable small marsupials like rock wallabies, animals that have been struggling. So they do all these things, but they're doing all these functions has been invisible, and we're all trying to make that more visible. And what Chris and his family know is that the land where the donkeys have been is more vibrant than land where donkeys haven't been. So anyway, tune in in particular to, Australian Broadcasting Corporation.
Yeah, Australian Story Program, one of the decades-old classic programs on ABC TV, our equivalent of the BBC type of thing.
Okay,
John
because
graciously filmed part of that.
yep, so we'll be hearing more about the donkeys of Kachana Station. So now I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk about forests and their importance to climate. Now, when we think of the word forest, we're usually thinking in terms of a noun. You know, there is a forest. But if we change our lens and think about forests from the standpoint of verbs, taking an improbable perspective, our understanding of what forests do opens up dramatically. So in that way, it's the same as the limited view of animals and animal impact that has long, held, thinking that, thinking of cows or reindeers as verbs helps us understand what they are doing and helps us pay attention to their role in the ecosystem and how we can apply this understanding to healing landscapes. So, about forests, I've been following biotic pump science for more than a decade now, specifically the work of Anastasia Makaryeva and her late mentor, Viktor Gorshkov. I mean, they are brilliant. It's really, really something. This April, I had the incredible opportunity to attend a conference on the biotic pump at the Technical University of Munich. Those insights are really present with me now, and that's why I want to share that. And the title of the event was Embracing Nature's Complexities. So the term biotic pump refers to functions of natural forests, like forests that evolve naturally as opposed to plantation forests, which do not have that function. And it's how forests move moisture around the world, and how, and in doing so, they're also moving heat. Okay? So basically, when you have a forest, a natural forest, all those trees are transpiring. So moisture is moving up, becoming vapor, and then it creates a low pressure zone, which acts as a kind of pump and pulls in moisture. So that's how places far from the coast get rain, get precipitation. So that's one function of the biotic pump, a really important function of the biotic pump, because where we're losing a significant number of trees, the biotic pump is starting to fail, such as in the Amazon rainforest. I mean, I've been hearing about this for more than a decade, of if a certain percentage of trees, if deforestation, not just deforestation, but degraded forests get beyond a certain point, they won't have the capacity to move the moisture in, and they're getting droughts in the Amazon rainforest. I mean, something that would have been unheard of. Then, in terms of climate, the biotic pump ensures that, so heat with evapotranspiration, it's as if the trees are harvesting heat and releasing it in the atmosphere as latent heat, as water vapor. So there's heat held in that. But when the biotic pump is functioning, it is released higher up in the atmosphere, where it is not engaging with greenhouse gases. So if the biotic pump is not functioning, then the heat is released lower and kind of hangs around and kind of gets stuck in that blanket of greenhouse gases. So that's really, really important. Now, the conventional wisdom is that climate trends of warming and cooling is all about CO2. The different view, and therefore a view that's improbable in our current context, is that Earth has developed an exquisitely fine-tuned system for regulating temperature and moisture that is driven by life. The life that dwells there, from flora, from plants, from fauna and fungi, and all the interactions among those life forms. So that's where I invite us all to go and to explore, to understand the dynamics that create our climate. This improbable perspective has real-world consequences which are now invisible because it does not fit the accepted climate narrative. And so this was something that Anastasia pointed out during that conference. So it's the notion of climate sensitivity. Climate sensitivity basically means the amount of warming per increase in CO2. So if you have a bunch of parking lots and asphalt roads and big buildings and sidewalks, and the CO2 rises, you're going to get a certain amount, or gets to a certain level, you're going to get a certain amount of heat. If you have forests that are harvesting and what's the word? Are kind of diffusing that heat. If you have healthy ecosystems that are absorbing solar energy and creating life out of it, then you have buffers to that heat. So it's really like as Anastasia would say, it's harder to make the world hot when you have functioning ecosystems. So I just think that's really important, and climate sensitivity is something that we might want to talk about as we're looking at different scenarios and our agency amidst different scenarios. So with that, I would love to invite questions, comments.